I'm going to talk about 50-50, some science, and then some how did I get here and how in the world do you live through graduate school, because that's not a trivial question sometimes. So I'm Matt Patterson. I work in the Department of Chemistry, although my office is actually in Nicholson Hall in the Physics Department, because that's where all our lab stuff is. In terms of my life, currently I work for the Superfund Research Center, which I'll describe in a minute. I did my PhD in the physics department. I finished just over a year ago. My dissertation was on single crystal metal oxides and metal clusters as model catalysts. And there's I think, an interesting story about why physics people ought to be concerned about catalysis. I did my bachelor's degree at Rice University, degrees in physics. I actually did a lot of undergraduate research in the mathematics department, largely because the math people were much nicer. That is not at all a trivial thing. I also did an REU here, actually at the time CAMD, our synchrotron facility over on Jefferson Highway, had its own REU program that folded a year or two after I was there. But I thought that was a fantastic experience. I loved it quite a bit. I loved what you could do in terms of material science research there, and that is what actually got me interested in applying to LSU for graduate school. So REUs are important, and the people you meet there may be sticking with you for a considerable portion of your career. I also spent a year as a music major, my freshman year of college here at LSU. I promise Dr. Dietz will tell you all about me if you go over to the School of Music and ask him. And there's probably pictures of me on the walls still from the percussion ensemble that year. I still kind of miss that, but it was clear it was not going to be the thing for me, so I made a change. And then I was sort of your standard overachiever in high school. This is maybe not a surprise for anybody considering doing some sort of sciencey research type thing with their life. So currently, like I said, I work for the Superfund Research Center housed at LSU. Superfund, for folks who don't know, is a government program that studies and cleans up hazardous waste sites of some kind. You may have heard of a place called Love Canal, which was heavily contaminated with industrial waste, and at the time you could literally just bury things in the ground, not tell anybody about it, build houses on top of it, and then act surprised when everybody gets cancer and dies. That is almost literally what happened, and this is why we now have large government agencies whose job is to make sure that that doesn't happen. In terms of the research center, this is a slide by one of the program administrators at NIH, the National Institutes of Health, that sort of demonstrates how and why we're organized. So the broad goal is to understand something about industrial pollutants, how they're emitted, how they're deposited, how they get into the environment. Underneath that, we have people in a lot of different fields studying various aspects of this problem. So over sort of on my side of this, we have chemistry, engineering, environmental science folks that study the mechanisms of formation, the chemical reactions that actually make pollutants and get them into the environment. Over on the other side, we have people who do a lot of killing of mice to determine how these things actually interact with biological systems, get into the body, what harm they can cause. And then we're all supposed to be thinking about remediation. So how in the world do we get these things not to happen and get people not to die of cancer or enhance susceptibility to flu infection or heart attacks brought on because you inhaled a bunch of pollutant-containing particles. So we're all working on that sort of problem from a lot of different angles. Our weekly meetings are very fun because we have physics and chemistry people talking to folks in the vet school and people in the medical school at University of Tennessee who are collaborating with us. And sometimes we all learn things, and sometimes we just stare at each other. It's a fun time. But really, when I was a kid, what I wanted to do when I grew up was be these guys. This is Mr. LaForge and Mr. Data from Star Trek: The Next Generation. They got to fly around the galaxy at warp speed and meet aliens and occasionally save the ship from blowing up. And that would still be very cool to be able to do. Unfortunately, what 20th century physics has basically taught us is that you will not be able to fly around the galaxy at warp speed with your android best friend. So far, that is beyond us. But what we have found to be very interesting is not necessarily what is out going to the stars and seeing what is out there, but actually looking at the other end of the length scale and seeing what happens when things get smaller and smaller. So this is sort of a powers of 10 view of the universe, I guess. This is a cell. It's about 20 this picture is an SEM image. It's about 20 microns, so 0.02 millimeters. This is the scale at which biology sort of dominates. The next image is 10 times smaller than that. The bright strands are individual RNA. This happens to be from HIV-1. This is about 2 microns. This is about 10 times smaller than that. These are small nanoclusters of silver. These are sort of tens of nanometers in every dimension. This is the kind of thing you might produce from a chemical reaction that creates nanoparticles. 10 times smaller than that, these are individual chains of silver atoms that have been deposited on a cobalt surface. You can see that these look sort of pixelated here. That is not because the image is of poor quality. That is because that is an individual atom wide. These are literally nature's pixels. That is, these structures are as literally one-dimensional as you can get, one atom after another. And 10 times smaller than that, these are oxygen atoms adsorbed to a nickel surface. So at the scale of 3 nanometers, everything was very perfect, right? Like things follow rules that you could imagine you could determine mathematically or with some kind of physics insight. As you go up and up and up and up, things get more complicated. Or if you think about it the other way, as you go farther and farther down, we start thinking about things in terms of physics and mathematics. And so what I'm usually concerned about in my work is these last 3 things. In particular, I care about these things because this is where chemistry actually takes place. If you think about any kind of chemical reaction involving a solid surface or a solid particle, this seems a little bit obvious to have to say out loud, but things don't stick to the inside of a particle. Things stick to the outside. If you think of a catalyst, sort of a high school understanding of that is actually pretty good. It's something that enables a chemical reaction to take place, but is not itself consumed. It could be ions in solution. It could be a big complicated molecule like an enzyme in your body that traps molecules and allows them to get together and react. Industrially speaking, you usually want some kind of solid so that you can flow liquids or gases over it. And you usually want, once you find something that works, you usually want a lot of them, and you want to be able to control their properties, their size, their shape, how many atoms, how much mass, how they're distributed, so that you can maximize whatever reaction you want to do. And like I said, the surface controls everything here. So this is a scanning tunneling microscope image of a model catalyst. This is palladium deposited on aluminum oxide. And using some cool techniques, you can actually image directly atoms on top of one of these particles. And you can very clearly see not every face of this thing is the same, right? On the top and the longer slanted sides here, you can see the atoms are packed in this hexagonal way. They're actually as close together as they can possibly be. On the smaller faces here, you can see they're not. They're in a square array. They're more open. Each atom has fewer neighbors. All of those things control their reactivity and controls the kind of chemical reactions they can do. So I started a physics degree, right? Well, everything is physics. You can't get away. Even if you were to fly on the Enterprise to another star, it would be physics that got you there. Sorry. So when I say we want to control the shape of a particle, what I'm really asking is, where are the atoms? How do they pack together? That's a physics question. When I say I want to control how things bind, what I'm asking is, where are the electrons going? And that's quantum mechanics. That's physics. It's a little bit weird, right? If you take a physics class, often you do problems where you solve for the behavior of 1 or 2 electrons at a time. All of a sudden, if we think of solving for the behavior of 10 to the 23rd electrons, that becomes chemistry. That's no longer a physics problem. Well, no, that's physics. That's just a lot of electrons. And in order to do the kind of experiments we want to do to get at these fundamental properties, we need the techniques of physics. So I'm going to talk about one particular experiment that I actually did as part of my graduate work, largely because the pictures are very pretty and it's a very nice, complete story. We do all these experiments in ultra-high vacuum. These are 2 of my undergraduate students, Hunter and Mark, looking at one of our vacuum chambers. And we have to do this because there's a lot of molecules in air, and most of them are things we don't want. If you think about molecules colliding with each other just sort of out in the world, at atmospheric pressure, individual molecule can travel tens of nanometers before it collides with another one or runs into just something else. That's not too good if you want to keep a sample clean. Preparing a high vacuum environment takes a lot of time. You need a huge stainless steel chamber that you can pump out. Often you need to heat the entire chamber to a few hundred degrees to get rid of stuff that is stuck to the walls of the chamber. This can take a day or more just to prepare the vacuum environment that you want. And it's expensive. These materials are not cheap. The machining of these is not cheap. And the labor cost of doing all this is quite considerable. But it's necessary. So if I said a minute ago, at atmospheric pressure, a molecule can travel at most 100 nanometers before it hits another molecule or just something else. At 10 to the minus 10 torr, atmosphere is 760, so this is many orders of magnitude different. At that low of a pressure, at 10 to the minus 10, an individual molecule could travel a quarter of the way around the Earth before it has a likelihood of hitting something else. So not a lot of particles in this system. As a consequence, for one, your sample stays clean because there's just not as much stuff in the chamber to stick to it. So you can guarantee that when you prepare a sample, it'll stay prepared for, let's be honest, hours, maybe a day. Even at ultra-high vacuum, there's still molecules around. If you want to do some kind of analysis using photons like X-rays or ultraviolet irradiation techniques, or if you want to do photoelectron spectroscopy and analyze electrons coming out of the sample, well, if an electron's coming out of the sample at atmosphere, it's immediately going to get captured by an atom in the atmosphere. If an electron's coming out of a sample in ultra-high vacuum, it can travel a very long way, and we can catch it in an analyzer and do some interesting stuff with it. And finally, control. This is where physics and chemistry are really different. There's nothing in that chamber that I didn't put in there. As a physicist, that is very important. I can guarantee that everything is nice and pristine and uniform. Physicists like things to be as simple as possible. I'm not a very good chemist. I don't do a lot of things in solution because it drives me crazy not knowing what is in the beaker before I started. Because even a little bit of contamination can do a lot of harm for you. Scanning tunneling microscopy, I showed you an STM image a few minutes ago. This is how we actually look at stuff directly on a surface. And this is actually a really simple technique. It's like reading Braille, except the little dots on the page are atoms in a sample. And instead of directly touching something with your finger, you're bringing a metal tip very close to the surface you want to look at and allowing electrons to tunnel through the tip, which you read off just as an electric current. The trick is all in the preparation of this tip, so you can ensure there's just a single atom dangling at the end of it. And in the electronics that it takes to ensure that all the voltages are stable, all the mechanical noise is damped out, and the temperature fluctuations are damped out. Because if things are moving around, right, things are just going to crash, and you're not going to get any images that are good. You can interpret, if you scan this tip over a surface, you can interpret the resulting current map you get as a map of where the atoms are, which is usually but not always correct. What you're really mapping is where are electrons. Typically, the voltages you use are between 1 and 5 volts. The currents you read are nanoamps, so this is not a big effect. You need lots of amplifiers and noise isolation and whatnot to read anything. This is the one equation I'll actually show you that has some meaning. This is rigorously quantum mechanically how you determine what the current through your tip ought to be for a given sample. There's a lot that goes into this. This is a simple expression that you can determine if you crunch through some of that and make some assumptions. The upshot of which is, for one, this looks like Ohm's law, so current is proportional to voltage. For two, you can see that because of this exponential term, if you change the height z by 1 angstrom, you change the current you read by a factor of 10. So you are very, very, very sensitive to very small changes in height because those are essentially amplified exponentially just by physics. So you can take very nice pictures. This is my favorite STM image that I've ever taken. These Dendritic type islands are gold deposited on a ruthenium substrate. This is 800 nanometers on a side. It took about 40 minutes to actually take the whole image. And each of these little dendritic islands is exactly 1 atom tall. So they're very broad, very flat, and you can see this extends over a large number of steps on the ruthenium surface. So you can take nice data. So now that I've talked about techniques, let me talk about one experiment that I did. This was for my thesis work. I said we're looking at catalysts, and two of the things we care about when we're talking about catalysts are how big are the particles that are actually enabling a reaction to happen, and how can we make nice big arrays of them that are well dispersed in such a way that you could actually do something with. So one of the ways to do that is to think about trapping them in some kind of template. This molecule looks like benzene. It's made up of boron and nitrogen, so it has the same number of electrons as benzene, but different atoms are actually donating them. This polymerizes very easily. This is actually kind of inconvenient to work with in the lab because it turns into a polymer just above room temperature. So keeping it a liquid is kind of a challenge. And when you deposit this on a metal surface at high temperature, it forms this very nice, very thin film honeycomb type structure. This is from a paper about a decade ago. This is one of the first times this had actually been shown. The reason for that structure is that what you actually have is many units of this borazine molecule are trying to bind to this metal surface. These boron-nitrogen bonds are quite stiff, so they can't compress or expand very much. But what it can do is rotate upward rigidly and sort of crumple in order to relieve the strain there. And what you wind up getting is this very nice regular structure of crumpling so that you make these little pore regions that are lower separated by little wire regions that are higher. So I have basically an egg carton on top of a metal crystal. So can I put eggs in it? Can I trap things in here? Yes. This is one of these rare cases where the answer is not ambiguous in physics. The answer is just yes. If I deposit gold on the surface, it does indeed stick inside the pores and nowhere else. If I take a line through a couple of particles and look at the heights, what I actually see is that these are discrete numbers of gold layers tall. So I can tell that I have some clusters that are 1 layer tall, some 2, some 3, because they're all at the same height, which is pretty nifty. These are roughly 2 nanometers wide at their biggest, which is smaller than the diameter of a hole in this, or a pore in this mesh. So these things are actually well confined, and I'm making well-defined sizes of particles. This is pretty cool. This is for a very small amount of gold. This is for 1/6 of a monolayer. A monolayer would be if I completely covered the entire surface with a layer of gold 1 atom thick. It's not an absolute unit of quantity, but it tells you how much you have relative to whatever is underneath. So this is a way of taking sort of an atom by atom picture of how these clusters are growing. Suppose I wanted to put some more down. Can I overspill the holes, basically? Is there a point at which I just form a continuous layer of gold, or these agglomerate, or what? Like, what is the limit of this trapping? So suppose I kick up the amount of gold I put down by an order of magnitude. Suppose I put 5 monolayers of gold down. Well, as it turns out, these things stay trapped. If you look at the histogram of size distributions here, it is very strongly peaked at about 3 nanometers in diameter. So that is sort of you could think of that as being the average size of one of these gold clusters if I put a lot of gold down. That is in fact smaller than the diameter of a pore. So mostly these things are staying confined to the pores in the mesh. There's now a wide variety of heights that are apparent, right? So I'm not just making 1, 2, 3 layers. I'm making, this one in this line scan is 2.5 nanometers tall, so I'm making tens of layers, and there's sort of a statistical distribution of heights, so I'm making a wide variety of particle sizes, but they're all still confined. You can even see inside this circle here in the zoomed image, these are maintaining the hexagonal spacing of that boron nitride film underneath. They really, really don't like to get out of the pores. They'll grow up in columns, but they will not overspill, at least not to this point. Now, if I look at a much larger region of the surface, these are pretty uniform. Like this is not just snow, this is not just noise. Each of these bright points is an individual gold cluster. And you can see over what for me is a pretty large region, this is 400 nanometers on a side, so almost half a micron on a side, I'm making a really well-dispersed array of gold particles. This is what you would want if you were going to make some kind of catalyst. If there's a reaction that can be enabled by a particle of this size, this is a way to make that happen by using this two-dimensional boron nitride template to put gold particles down. This is not necessarily something you could figure out by using a wet chemistry technique or by using an electron microscope that does not have this kind of resolution, or God forbid, using a light microscope. This image is 400 nanometers on a side. That is starting to get out of the wavelength region of visible light. Each of these, I mean, some of these images I'm showing you are small, length scales much smaller than a virus, if you want something to compare to. So this is basically what physics can bring to chemistry, this knowledge of what is happening atom by atom for a process that you happen to care about. We got a publication out of this. We are working on more, so that's pretty cool and also necessary because I needed to graduate, and you need publications for that. We're also working with some collaborators who do computational work to get a little bit more detail about things we can't access with experiments, like where are electrons sitting in these clusters. And what they've actually determined is that the gold clusters, when you put them down, acquire a little bit of negative charge, but it's not just averaged over the cluster, it's actually sitting on the atoms at the perimeter, and the ones in the middle are nearly neutral. And as you add subsequent layers, the clusters are still negatively charged, but it's mostly on that bottom layer and mostly at the perimeter. So that is actually a hint as to where some kind of reaction might happen, where you have these excess electrons that are basically localized and ready to grab onto something that really wants that extra electric charge. So one of the things we're looking at experimentally is what kind of chemistry can you actually do with that? And that is still ongoing. And even though I now work for Superfund, which is on a completely different topic, this is something I'm still very much interested in, largely because I can see what individual atoms are doing, and that's pretty cool. So I want to talk a little bit about the graduate school and postdoc experience. The Calvin and Hobbes comic, many of you all are too young to actually remember Calvin and Hobbes being in a newspaper, but it is one of my favorite newspaper comic strips, and Calvin's dad's punchline here is that there are things you're not allowed to know until it's too late to avoid it, which is, I think, what a lot of people's graduate school experience is like. So there's a couple of lessons that I picked up that I wish I'd known about, or that weren't communicated very clearly, that I think it's important to talk about. So the most important thing is classes. You've already taken a bunch, you're in college, you're about to get a degree, maybe you have one already. You're good at passing classes. You've taken a lot of them at one time. You haven't taken classes like this. This was my course schedule from my first semester as a graduate student. Note that it's 9 hours. That is a full-time course load for a grad student. And this is the most courses I ever took at one time as a graduate student. This is like 40 to 50 pages of handwritten problem sets every week. That is much more intense than my most intense semester as an undergraduate. Why do they throw this at you? Because you already know a bunch of stuff. What you need to do is get really good, master whatever foundational knowledge is necessary to be mastered to do research, deepen your knowledge of these things. An undergrad degree in physics doesn't really get you past 1940 in terms of physics knowledge, so there is stuff that you have to know. And there are topics you have to learn about if you're going to be able to do research. And also, most importantly, you probably have some sort of written exam that you have to pass in order to actually continue as a graduate student and get to do research, and it is only to your benefit to pass that as quickly as possible. To do whatever it takes to pass your classes, master that stuff, and get the exams over with. Not because they're not important or because they're just a hurdle to jump, but because it is a thing that could stand in your way of progressing. And it only gets more painful if you let it drag on. You might find yourself drowning in things like this. This is an equation that I'm not going to tell you is meaningful, but I am going to tell you this is something I actually submitted for a homework assignment. To this day, I don't really know if there's a typo in there somewhere. It's too much. But this is, you may find yourself drowning, but this is a finite period of time. It's important to master, but classes, unlike doing an undergraduate degree, are not the important thing. Next topic, the most important thing is communication. This is Richard Feynman, one of the 20th century's great theoretical physicists. One of the reasons we remember him in particular, as opposed to some of the other folks who worked with him or at the same time, is that he was also a brilliant science communicator. He's the person that NASA put on the news after the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded to explain why it exploded. He had a saying that you didn't really understand something until you could explain it to an undergraduate, and there were topics that he freely admitted he couldn't. I'm not necessarily sure I think that's true, but it's an important lesson to keep in mind because you have to be able to write to get out of graduate school. You probably had to be able to write to get into graduate school, but you have to get a dissertation out, which is several hundred pages long. You have to be able to write papers that actually get published. So write something that's not just for you and your group, but that an editor and external readers are going to be able to understand and say is worth putting in the record in the scientific literature forever. You have to be able to give talks and presentations to all kinds of audiences. You have to be able to give technical talks at a conference. You have to be able to talk to a crowd like this. You have to be able to talk to people at parties about what you do so they're convinced you're not a boring person. You have to convince people to give you money. You need grants, you need fellowships. Even as a graduate student, as you just heard, it's good to be able to get fellowships and little bits of funding here and there. If you become a professor, you need money to do research, so you have to be able to write proposals to funding agencies that convince them that what you're doing is worthwhile. You have to teach. If you become a professor, you're probably going to be teaching classes. Even as a graduate student or a postdoc, you'll be TAing, maybe not. You'll probably be supervising other people in your lab. You have to be able to communicate to people what you need them to do and why they should care about it. And, you know, there's more things here that I probably am not even thinking of. You probably didn't learn how to do that in any class. I never had a presentations class. I never had a how to write a grant class or how to write a paper class. A lot of that I learned on the street, basically. So these are skills that you have to pick up that almost nobody, we don't emphasize enough. If you ask a famous novelist, how did you learn how to write a novel, what they will almost always tell you is that they read. You have to learn how to read a science paper. You have to learn what those sound like, what those feel like, how they're structured, how long it takes to get to the point. A lot of people don't get to the point very quickly. Pay attention to people's presentations. Figure out what you respond to. Figure out what you don't like. Figure out what is terrible. It helps if you have coursework in this. It really helps if graduate programs take the time to teach people how to do it. But this is a lot of stuff that you have to pick up on your own. And as in a lot of areas of life, musical performance is one that comes to mind. The only way to learn how to do it is to actually do it. Okay, the most important thing is self-advocacy. You have to figure out how to take care of yourself through this marathon because you're the one who's going to be looking out for you all the time. I'm about to break a presentation rule and present you with a wall of text that is important. This is from a letter from an academic program committee that was sent to a bunch of astronomy graduate students at a fairly prominent research program a couple of years ago. I will not name it here. If you decide to Google for it, you can find it pretty easily, however. This was addressing expectations for work for graduate students. What they said was, well, we can't really tell you how much you're supposed to work because the real measure is how productive you are and how much you publish. But 80 to 100 hours a week is a pretty good measure. Like, if you ask us, that's what we did, so that's what you should be doing. Nobody had to tell us to do that. We just loved it so much that we were at work all the time. Oh, but if you have a family, we know you can't do that, so even if you can only devote 60 hours a week, we'll work with you. 98 hours a week is 14 hours a day, every day. Let me suggest a possible response if somebody seriously tells you you have to work 100 hours a week every week. You're doing stuff that nobody has done before as a graduate student. That is why it is research. If you're going to go where no one's gone before, you have to want it. You have to do the work. And nobody can guarantee how much work it is going to take or how long it's going to take to get a result. That is true. You have to work hard. There is no way around that. In fact, it's more important that you work hard than you be a brilliant genius who has awesome ideas. It is far more important that you be able to see through the ideas that you have to the end. But you signed a contract to work. You did not sign away your immortal soul. So don't let other people's odd expectations influence you unduly as far as how you personally are able to be productive. You should talk to everybody that you can, students, postdocs, professors, anyone. But you need to do that by way of being informed. So find out what you're signing on to and seriously think about what it's going to take to be able to succeed. Graduate students are usually paid stipends and usually have tuition covered for them. And what people will almost always tell you, and this is true, is that if you don't have funding to do a PhD, you should not do it, because as hard as it is, it would be even harder if you had to have another full-time job to pay for it. But keep in mind that salary expectations for a graduate stipend are very small compared to what you could make with a bachelor's degree working at a chemical plant or for a biotech company. Or, let's be honest, teaching high school in East Baton Rouge Parish, you would make twice as much and get better benefits. Benefits are an important thing, by the way. You're young and healthy, you might get hit by a car or get leukemia. Something might happen, and you have to, that is not actually funny. This has happened to people. You need to figure out how you're going to take care of yourself if that happens. Living costs money. You have to pay the rent. You have to eat. You have to eat well enough that your health doesn't suffer, and you have to pay the rent at a place where you're safe and comfortable living. Safety is more important than comfort there, obviously, but both matter. You should probably find out what resources are available to you on campus, not just in terms of creature comforts, but concrete things like student health services. LSUs are actually pretty good. There's a lot of stuff the Student Health Center does for you. They have their own x-rays, they can do their own labs, they've got a pharmacy, all that's fairly cheap. Other places don't necessarily have that. Also resources in terms of how are you going to be able to do your science. You should know something about the department you plan to apply to in advance. And finally, time to completion. This is not meant to scare people, but this is a marathon. I want to say the average time to finish in physics is on the order of 6 to 7 years. Some fields finish faster than others. Other science fields finish in more or less time. Some universities set hard length requirements on how long you can be there working on a PhD, some don't. But this is going to take a lot of time. If you're coming right from an undergraduate degree, this is going to take most of your 20s. I think there are worse things than spending most of your 20s working on really cool science. I'll be honest, I wanted to be Mr. LaForge when I was a kid, so I am pretty much living the dream. I didn't realize that Geordie probably spent more time fixing the warp core than going places, but that's life. You have to decide whether that's important enough for you to spend this much time at it. And nobody can tell you whether it is or not. That's something that you have to figure out. Finally, the most important thing is to be a person. I love atoms. They don't love me back. That's just how it is. If you want to be loved back, get a dog. I did. She's great. Find ways to stay connected with the world around you. I do stuff outside of science. My particular thing is politics and community activism. That does not have to be everybody's thing, but you should have something that gets you excited and makes you you apart from what you're doing in the lab. Because there are going to be days when everything goes wrong and the lab catches fire, and you need to have something that keeps you going. Stay connected with the people around you. This entire group of people is a wedding party that I was in. Like all 30 of them were a wedding party, which is insane. But I wouldn't have wanted to miss this in favor of being in the lab. These are a lot of my college friends. These are people who have been close to me for years. This is another wedding I was at this summer. I went to 8th grade with the bride. Those are connections that matter, and they matter to me probably more than making model catalysts or learning where the atoms go in a particular reaction. Science is important. Being a person is important too. And if you find that one of those things is dragging you away from that other thing, it's important to pause and think about what you're doing. Which is not to say that you can't be a scientist if other things are important to you, but it's better to think about your priorities up front than to find that you're in a position you don't want to be in. And that is actually the end of what I've got. I will leave us on this little mountain scene and take any questions that come up.
Questions?
So I talked a lot about catalysis, so let me talk about something else, just for funsies. One of the things we are starting to be able to do now is actually control, not just make nanoparticles of a particular shape and size, but actually control things like their magnetic state. So there was a Nobel Prize in physics a number of years ago given for something called giant magnetoresistance, which is a phenomenon where as you crank I'm going to get this wrong, as you crank a magnetic field up, the electrical resistance of material increases far beyond what you thought it would be. We are able now to manipulate particles and create little magnetized nanoparticles in such a way that you can do fun things with their magnetization. Giant magnetoresistance and its cousin colossal magnetoresistance, they'd already used the word giant, so they had to pick another one. Those are used heavily in spinning hard drives. The little magnetic bits that actually store information in a drive are read out by exploiting that phenomenon. Of course, now we have everybody has a solid state drive because those are much faster. Technology does march on, but we are still finding ways to manipulate the spin states of little bitty particles. Another thing I would say is you can use little magnetic particles as biological tags for things. Like these are, if you get a contrast MRI, the contrast agent is actually a little magnetic metal particle, right? And it shows up really brightly when you put it in a big magnetic field. So you can exploit those kinds of responses of nanoparticle systems for studying interesting things or data storage or just anything like that beyond chemistry. And the reason I sound like I'm flailing is because I'm mostly a physicist and a chemist, so I don't know as much about that. Basically, the more properties you can control, the more stuff we find to do with them.
Go ahead.
Yes and no. Life is different as a postdoc than as a graduate student. I supervise more than I used to. I have a couple of undergraduates working in the lab. We have a second-year graduate student now working for us, and I'm the one who's down there a lot making sure that work gets done. So it is a different sort of task to do. Sometimes it's less stressful than actually cranking the wrenches to put together a chamber myself. Sometimes it's more stressful. I feel a little less under the gun as a postdoc than as a graduate student because I already know how to do things. I guess I would put it that way. Like, I know publishing a paper is not some intimidating new task. It's a thing that I know how to do if I get enough data to write about. Like a lot of the things that writing a dissertation, for example, is this horribly intimidating mountain until you actually start doing it, and then you realize, wait, I know how to do this, right? So in terms of things that used to cause me stress, yeah, they don't cause me so much stress anymore. Do I still work as much as I did? Yes, I do. It's just different kinds of work.